Welcome, everyone. Um I am not Max Grossman. I am not the director of the Meyerhoff Program and Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Maryland. I did once have that title, but thankfully I do not. I am ventriloquizing for Professor Grossman, who is having a case of laryngitis and coughing. But I will also say that it is a super, super, super pleasure to introduce Seth Schwartz. I'm using text prepared for me, but before that, I'm going to ad lib and say that the most important thing, at least for me, about Seth Schwartz is that he was my TA many, many years ago in my freshman year of college in Morton Smith's Ancient Near East class. And everything I know about lots of things stem from Seth Schwartz's work. Uh, but let me do the formal introduction. So Seth Schwartz is a social and cultural and political historian of ancient Jews whose scholarship locates them in their Hellenistic, Roman, and early Christian environments. Seth is the Lucius N. Littauer Professor of Classical Jewish Civilizations at Columbia University. He has held Guggenheim and NEH fellowships, as well as fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem and the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also been a member of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. The author of numerous books and articles, Professor Schwartz's monographs include The Ancient Jews from Alexander to Muhammad, Were the Jews a Mediterranean Society, Reciprocity and Solidarity in Ancient Judaism, and Imperialism and Jewish Society. And I'm going again to ad lib and say, Seth, if you want to say something about your latest work, we'd love to hear it. Professor Schwartz joins Michael Brenner, Marsha Rosenblit, and Rachel Shine as the fourth speaker in the center's 5 Points lecture, which invites scholars to reflect on 5 statements, questions, data points, or quotations that have driven their research agenda or their outlook on teaching over the course of their work. We envision this series as an opportunity for scholars to reflect on what they do and how they do it, and perhaps for some, even why. And with no further ado, I present to you my friend and colleague, Seth Schwartz.
Thank you, Chaim. I'm delighted to be reminded of those olden days. And actually, I'll have a little bit more to say about them in the course of the talk. And I'd also really like to thank Max and the Meyerhoff Center and Avis for all of her help and the fact of the invitation. In fact, that was my first response, as I mentioned to Max when I saw the invitation, is how odd that the series is named after New York's first and most notorious slum. Which was a subject of a really riveting book by a neighbor of yours at George Washington University, Tyler Anbinder, an American historian, and also a subject of a fantastic movie by Martin Scorsese, The Gangs of New York. But I'm talking to a group of people who don't even live in New York, and Max isn't even from New York, so it all seemed very confusing to me. Why 5 points? I don't know. And I guess maybe there's something about the theme of slumming and soporific opium, which will prove to be especially relevant to the time that's coming. Well, anyway, be that as it may. What I'm trying to do in this talk is to sort of say a little bit about the intellectual underpinnings of the development of my work over the last, I'm sorry to say, 40 years. Which means, tracing a series of epistemological shifts through basically a series of texts which I think embody those shifts. And what that means is that I'm not presenting primary texts. I'm presenting things which influenced my thinking about my work, with sometimes evoked a negative response. I'll be talking about a few texts which I'm actually not putting up, sharing in the PowerPoint. the texts don't all come from Jewish studies. As you can see, the first one does. It's from a book by Jacob Neusner. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the other ones come from outside of the field. And they don't come from the primary texts that I work on. And I'm also not trying to provide a kind of précis of my work, just because this is how I wrote the paper. I could have gone in that direction. And I know that the other people who spoke in the series, and Marcia's here, and I actually listened to her talk last night in preparing for this, and went in slightly different directions. But why don't they come from the primary sources? And I think that it would be fair to say that what initially gave impetus to my career was the need. I mean, one of the things it did was the need to reckon with the text that I studied as a kid with a very traditional Jewish education. One thing that I was sure of was that I didn't understand any of the texts that I was studying at some level, that they all seemed completely opaque to me. And that applies both to not so much to the biblical text, but to the rabbinic texts that I studied in school, in elementary school, in high school, and into college, but also to the Greek and Latin texts that I began studying late in high school and into college. And that I also felt that the pure internalism of my Jewish education, and incidentally also of much of my classical education, just confused me even more. I felt that there was no way to explain the texts from themselves, from within. I mean, I shouldn't exaggerate the extent of my confusion. I was a perfectly adequate student in all these fields. I mean, I didn't fail anything, but I also intuited that at a very early age that I needed to be farther outside the texts in order to make sense of them. There were people, and I knew people, and I wasn't one of them, who could dive into the ideational world of the Talmud, no questions asked, and simply, plunge in and become part of it. I wasn't such a person. I also, entertained the idea, I think in college, that academic rabbinics, as opposed to yeshiva-style rabbinics, might be a way to approach the material. But the one course that I ever took at it, which was at Hebrew University, circa 1977-78, turned out to be every bit as hermetic and internalist as any shiur I had ever attended, except that the only difference was that, in all honesty, it was duller. And the reason it was duller wasn't necessarily because the field is duller, but just because I probably made a bad choice of professor. But if it had really grabbed me, I think that that wouldn't have mattered very much. So you could say that a thick fog enveloped the remote Jewish past, that is the world of the Talmud. But a thick fog also enveloped the much more recent Jewish past of my grandparents' pre-Soviet Eastern Europe. And these things were for me closely related. And it's the reason why I was so eager to try to dispel the fog, is because there was something I was convinced that the fog enshrouded something which was more profound and meaningful than post-war suburbia, not to mention the lower middle class and working class immigrant worlds in which my parents had grown up. I actually think, and I know Marcia talked about this in her talk last year a little bit, that many members of my generation in the U.S. who became Jewish historians actually had similar feelings. I think, people have different stories. My parents weren't Holocaust survivors. They were American. I was surrounded by Holocaust survivors, though, in my family. But, I think there's a way in which it was a kind of a stage in the process of acculturation to be more interested in your grandparents' world than in your parents' world, or more precisely in the world that your grandparents had left behind. In some, it was a kind of half rebellion against the emerging institutions of 20th century American Judaism, and a desire to recover, if only intellectually, in the case of academic historians, not in other people's cases, a deeper, maybe a more catastrophic and painful, but certainly, as one innocently thought about these things when one was a teenager and a young adult, a more authentic Jewish past than what we were confronting in the emerging American Jewish life of suburbia. It was simply trying very hard to be too happy and light. And that didn't suit everyone. So we looked to a past. Now, the trouble for me was that I was very puritanical when I was a kid. And I thought that anything more recent than, about 1500 was basically the present. And the present was tainted. And the study of the present felt to me to be too journalistic. By the way, I should say that I now know the truth. And that, at some level, my real interest was always actually 19th century Eastern Europe. But I didn't realize when I was a kid just how difficult it would be to do that properly. And if I had realized that, that's what I would have done. Instead, I thought, I want to go back to the sort of rabbinic roots of traditional Jewish society, which I felt was more like actual scholarship than just, learning about the 19th century, which just seemed, not really entirely respectable as a field. But that meant that I could never escape the enigmatic and frustrating texts that I had grown up with, and I think I was motivated by trying to make sense of them. Now, since I was approaching Jewish antiquity from a pretty early time, I should also say that I never wanted to do anything else that I can remember. In other words, I'm not one of those people who was inspired by a college professor or made a sort of random choice during graduate school. I always wanted to do what I'm doing. So many of these developments for me came at a very early age, and my initial ideas about them definitely lacked maturity because they were kid stuff. I was a kid. But what I was doing was I was approaching Jewish antiquity from a concern with the extent and nature of the Jews' integration in their ancient setting. That's what was interesting to me about Eastern Europe and about our situation in America. And what this meant was that purely internal Jewish history was a non-starter. And I needed to study not just Greek and Latin texts, but more generally Hellenistic and Roman history. Now, in the year that I was in Israel, the same year that I had my unrequited flirtation with academic rabbinics, I took ancient Jewish history classes at Hebrew U, but initially paid very little critical attention to their involution, to the ways in which Jerusalem-style Jewish history, which in 1977-78 was actually at its peak. That's one thing that we get from David Myers' 2009 revision of his earlier work about the subject. That was actually the high point of Jerusalem Jewish history, and it was thoroughly Zionist. It was completely involuted. The whole point of it was that the Jews had, a kind of agency, and that their institutions were self-generating. It's not that they weren't, as it were, influenced by things outside, but things that they did themselves. And that was what mattered about them. That was the important part of the story. It's not a totally incorrect view, but it's just that it's not a very satisfactory understanding of Jewish history in general. And I was not yet inclined to be critical of it, partly because the intellectual environment at the Hebrew University was so much richer than anything that I was experiencing in America, that I was kind of inclined to overlook its shortcomings in short term. Things changed in graduate school. I would say that in graduate school, which was at Columbia in the starting 1979, but into the early 80s. I had no grasp of any theoretical issues. In general, they didn't seem to be strongly on the agenda in the study of antiquity at the time. And so I was a certain kind of historical positivist, but I was taught to be very concerned about methodologies of reading. In other words, we have a limited amount of information about the past. The information is highly mediated, comes to us through texts, among other things, and the texts don't simply tell a transparent story about antiquity. They have to be approached in the proper way, and that way was not internalist. And so in graduate school, I turned against Jerusalem history. And by the way, in Jerusalem itself, there was a big difference between rabbinic history and pre-rabbinic history. Second Temple history had different intellectual roots than rabbinic history and a different set of practices, although it was not motivated by a kind of overarching Zionism. I would argue, and actually I've just argued in a paper, that its real roots were in Berlin Altertumswissenschaft. That's where it really comes from. Unlike rabbinic history, which comes from somewhere else, it doesn't come from Berlin Altertumswissenschaft, klassische Altertumswissenschaft. That's where it continuous. It can be proved. Anyway, this brings me to my first text, my first point, which is just a quotation. It's simply the first two paragraphs of Jacob Neusner's first truly Neusnerian book, published in 1970, where he turns his back on the positivistic attempt to write a biography of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, the first important post-destruction rabbinic figure, and has come to the conclusion that the only way to approach the subject is by analyzing the rabbinic traditions about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and looking to them not in the final analysis to reconstruct the life of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, but to understand the forces that shaped the traditions about him through rabbinic literature. Neusner had already written not only his earlier, very traditional sounding biography of Yochanan ben Zakkai, but by this time he'd also published his precociously logoriac History of the Jews of Babylonia in 5 volumes. Here he's totally shifted, and he's become something like, an early 20th century German New Testament scholar. In terms of his approach to the material. It's no longer about recovering the historical Jesus. It's about recovering the communities which preserved and shaped traditions about Jesus. And here it's the same thing. Of course, this is not an accident. He was basically channeling the New Testament scholar Rudolf Bultmann through the intermediation of Morton Smith, who was not initially Neusner's teacher, but who became a strong influence on him in this period. Now, I was immersed in the work of Neusner when I was in graduate school, partly at the recommendation of Morton Smith. And Morton Smith specifically recommended this book, which Morton Smith, in all honesty, probably played some... I won't say what I'm about to say, because who knows what kind of trouble it could get me in. So I won't say it, but you might be able to figure it out anyway. This is still Neusner anyway you slice it, and this began the career of the famous Neusner, of the Neusner we all know. What I learned from Neusner, although he never described his own work in this way, was to think of the Mishnah and of other rabbinic works as texts and not as archives. There was a long tradition of treating rabbinic texts as if they were just collections of material, of primary material, and you could use them without any hesitation in order to reconstruct the Jewish past of the rabbinic period. And there's even the old-time Jerusalem Jewish historian Victor Cherikover, who was trained in St. Petersburg in pre-revolution and then in Berlin, wrote a review of a set of new works on rabbinic history in the 1930s, including Louis Finkelstein and some others, praising this work as, finally making adequate use of the archival resources that are available to scholars in the form of rabbinic literature. And Neusner is saying, no, these are not rabbinic. They're texts which are shaped by the concerns which shape all texts. They're shaped by environmental concerns, by social concerns, by political concerns. They don't offer us unmediated, quasi-archival access to the past. Not that archives are necessarily unmediated either. But, for an ancient historian who doesn't work on archives, we think that archives are like a pure, direct window into the past. So to argue that a collection of texts is actually not that, but it's something that has to be analyzed very carefully and, is a very important thing to understand. And Neusner helped me understand this, this work especially. And after a while, the profit in reading Neusner's works began to diminish, but in this early period in the 70s through 1981, I think there was a tremendous amount to be learned, and I learned it from him. The issue is, again, back to how to do history in a low evidence regime. When you have texts, and what do you do with the texts that you have? You can't simply string together stories. You have to subject everything to extremely critical analysis. And the relationship of this to a kind of German historical tradition is very striking. My friend and colleague, John Ma, pointed out to me that the epigrapher and historian was born in the 1860s and died in the 1940s, Friedrich Hiller von Gertringen, had used a really memorable phrase to describe the correct mode of approach to ancient texts, which he described as das Pflicht des Apistein. That is the duty to disbelieve, apistein in Greek. The duty to disbelieve. It is we have an obligation to disbelieve what our texts tell us. This is only mildly crazy, but it's only mildly crazy. It's actually largely a correct approach. Nevertheless, now that doesn't mean that texts are useless, but Neusner is showing us other things that you can do with the text. That is, you can reconstruct the circumstances which create the text. You may not be able to say much about the person who the text is describing, but you can actually say a lot anyway. So texts themselves are artifacts. They are things which help us understand a moment or a series of moments in the past, but they don't necessarily tell us the things that we think that they're telling us. Okay. Around the same time, I was also introduced and became deeply engaged in the work of another scholar of the same vintage as Neusner. It was like a precise contemporary of Neusner, but from a completely different kind of background. And this was Peter Brown, the historian of late antiquity. And my second text comes from the first book by Brown that I ever encountered. This is a collection produced in 1982 called Society in the Holy and Late Antiquity. I was also reading his very precocious synthesis, The World of Late Antiquity, which had been written a few years earlier. This particular essay, Learning and Imagination, was the inaugural lecture that Brown had given at Birkbeck College in 1977. And here, I'm not going to read it, but he's headed in a very, very, very different kind of direction than Neusner. In fact, one of the problems with Neusner was that if you have, as Hiller von Gertringen put it, a duty to disbelieve, then how exactly are you supposed to go about writing history? You have to, what are you supposed to do? What's your way in? Is there a way to unlock this straitjacket of such thoroughgoing skepticism? And Neusner himself did not do so. Neusner himself stopped engaging in any sort of effort to reconstruct history in the early 1980s. Many of his followers did so as well. They just discarded it. They said it's no longer of interest. We're not doing it anymore. And that didn't work for me either. So in Brown, I found a different model. Now, what Brown is doing in this essay in general is advocating an eclectic approach to the use of anthropology by ancient historians, out of the conviction that it could humanize historical actors who emerge from the primary sources as mere ciphers. It could refine and control the injunction of the German positivistic tradition, in a slightly different tradition than Hiller von Gertringen, that the historian is obliged to try to feel his or her way back into the past, which is not how Brown put it. Now, Brown actually thought that you could believe things that ancient texts say about their protagonists, but you had to understand them correctly. And one way of understanding them correctly was by bringing to bear on them sorts of considerations which come from outside the text, but also from outside of the immediate environment in which the texts were produced. So we're really breaking the text open to all sorts of comparative investigation. Now, my dissertation advisor, Morton Smith, I never really spoke to him about Peter Brown, I don't think, not that I can remember. I can't imagine that he would have had much patience for Brown. But it might not have been so simple. Morton Smith's reading in anthropology existed, but it was limited and archaic, as far as I know. He cited W. Robertson Smith and J.G. Fraser, who come from a generation or two before Evans Pritchard and Gluckman and the people that, and certainly Mary Douglas, the people that Brown is citing here. He didn't use it that much, and yet there was more to Smith than simply the hermeneutics of suspicion applied to absolutely everything. What Smith actually explicitly taught me was a version of the hypothetico-deductive method, which he himself attributed to Harry Wolfson, who himself attributed, according to Smith, and not just according to Smith, to Yeshivas Knesset Yitzchak of Slobodka, where Wolfson heard lectures by Chaim of Risk himself. So, in other words, this, we're not just doing this sort of corrosive hermeneutics of suspicion. We're actually approaching things, according to Smith, a little bit differently, leaving aside the question of Morton Smith's debt to Brisker Lumdos, which he expressed me mainly as a kind of joke. What this meant in substance was that through extensive reading in the sources, you could generate hypotheses which might then be brought to bear on a close reading of the sources to test the hypotheses' hermeneutical utility. Your hypotheses explain things in the text better than those of others, to then enable you to read the sources in new and unexpected ways. In other words, you don't work inductively. You're not just reading a text and creating a narrative by reading the text, but they work through a mixture of deduction and induction. The result is that after doing the demolition, that is after imposing on the text the requisite level of skepticism, it was possible with enough caution to proceed with construction by producing a new synthesis which would take fully into account the skeptical textual analysis with which you began. This synthesis could be constructed by a process of balancing argument and evidence in ways that were both mutually reinforcing and mutually problematizing. This was Smith's own approach in his first important book, Palestinian Parties and Politics That Shaped the Old Testament, a book that gave a strong, intentionally reductive cold slap in the face to biblical history. When I discovered Brown's collection. Now, what's the connection of this to Brown? Well, it doesn't quite map onto Brown very well. When I discovered Brown in graduate school, I fell in love with his work. And even though it was apparently at odds with what I was learning, both Brown and Smith clearly valued intuition, but Brown was poetic, evocative, an eclectic reader of ancient texts, a deployer of ancient non-textual evidence and of comparative material, while Brown was not above deploying the language and conceptual apparatus of post-war social science in limited ways. This is on display in his early classic, though it is actually very deeply flawed, The Rise and Function of the Holy Man in Late Antiquity, from the Journal of Roman Studies, 1971. The first thing that seduces most readers of Brown's work was the beauty of his prose. By contrast, my most important teachers, Morton Smith and later on Keith Hopkins, both specialized in writing that was clear, concise, and didactic, but often quite acidically skeptical and argumentative. Brown, like Smith, lived in a state of virtually monastic immersion in his topic. But his writing conveyed intimacy with his material, while Smith's writing conveyed distance. They were driven by drastically different epistemologies. Now, as personal types, there were actually links between them. Both of them struggled with Christianity, and both went through phases of very, very strong commitment to various types of Christianity, in Morton Smith's case, not excluding a strong attraction to actual monasticism. And both emerged from it eventually, Smith into complete skepticism and Brown into a kind of moderate level of commitment. But as scholars, Brown evoked and Smith analyzed. Brown brought whatever tools came to hand, ancient evidence anthropology, his own extensive and intensely aware travel, and more, all in the service of creating beautiful, evocative, and compelling syntheses, which did not shy away from describing the deepest interiority of his late antique cast of characters. It took me a while to see through the beauty of Brown's writing and, to use a Brownian locution, the shimmering magnificence of his late antique imaginary. But I did eventually. I still love Brown's work and read his autobiography, which came out a few years ago, with great interest and pleasure. And it's impossible not to admire his achievement in creating late antiquity as an essential field in modern university education. Peter Brown was and remains a massive intellect. But I have to admit that I became disenchanted with Peter Brown. And this is illustrated by a brief episode. I mean, the reasons for this disenchantment are illustrated by a brief exchange, which he reports himself with Dame Averill Cameron. He talks about it in his memoir. Cameron wondered about the typicality of Brown's poignant anecdotes, given the extreme paucity of the evidence. Brown had claimed that there was a group of well-educated men in the northern Mesopotamian city of Haran as late as the 10th century who were still reading classical texts and, living a classical lifestyle. And Dame Averill was skeptical about this because it was mentioned in passing only in a single text that Brown had found. Was it really legitimate, as Brown was not above doing, to predict, as it were, the mentalities of entire societies from isolated anecdotes, however brilliant and unexpected? Brown's unself-conscious report of his own response to Cameron at the time is as follows. So this took place in the early 1970s, and he's reporting it a few years ago in his memoirs. Quote, "As a medievalist, I was used to dealing with periods of rich evidence, that is, unlike people in antiquity, I'm adding. This meant that I was more confident than she, Averill Cameron, was that one example, if well chosen, could be corroborated by many others. Now, the many other examples don't exist. There was only one. So what Peter Brown was saying was that, well, he was able to claim that this was an important text simply on the basis of his authority. That, he is an expert. And as an expert, he knew that this was a text which could be generalizable because he knew what it was like. He knew what a generalizable text looked like. And now, you know, I'm not actually taking this lightly. I think Peter Brown is an expert, and like others who circularly claim expertise as the justification for their specific opinions, I would not automatically dismiss their views. We can think of people closer to our fields who also speak basically without argumentation, but with expertise. And there are times when you have to take them really seriously. Because, well, they're right. They are experts and they do know what they're talking about. Um, but I would still say that self-consciousness, the positing of distance rather than immersive familiarity, the argumentative rather than the magisterial style, eventually, for me, had to prevail. Because I didn't think that, you know, the claim of expertise in itself was enough, however hard-earned, to allow one to make positivistic claims on the basis of small bodies of information. Now, we can't pretend that we fully understand the world just because, well, not to be reductive, we've read some texts, looked at some comparative ethnography, and thought and contemplated really deeply. Our ancient world is other. It's poorly attested and separated from us by a yawning gulf. Brown still needs to be taken seriously. His intuition is and was immense. You know, he knew very well what it was like to live in a world governed by a regime dominated by scarcity of resources, high mortality and morbidity, limited mobility, low levels of literacy, and so on. The fact that this is never far from what Brown is describing gives his version of late antiquity its verisimilitude, which is very hard won. Furthermore, you know, there is a place for empathetic imagination in history writing. But some of us are more austere and find it harder to allow ourselves such liberties and are stuck with the otherness of our subjects. And anyway, that's not the end of the story, although probably should begin to make it the end of the story. But let's just take, you know, look at one last development, and that last development is, you know, not so far away. But I'm not going to. You know, I think, you know, in order to write the book that I published in 2001, Imperialism and Jewish Society, I still needed an intellectual revolution. I couldn't do it on the basis of the tools that I had at my disposal, and I think the intellectual revolution actually came from my exposure to, you know, another great mind in the field, and that's Keith Hopkins. My exposure to Keith Hopkins was the result of my having been hired to work on a project, a research project in King's College, Cambridge in 1992. And I spent 3 years in intense intellectual communion with Keith. Keith was a professor of ancient history at Cambridge, and someone of, you know, really scintillating and stimulating intellect, and with whom I found myself in some sort of natural sense of agreement. He started with the same skeptical foundation that I was starting from, but he pushed it further, and he insisted, and it's slightly in common with Brown. He insisted, you know, that you actually have to approach the text from the outside in a systematic way. The hypothesis which you use in order to, you know, approach your primary material has to be generated by, you know, systematic thought about how societies and cultures work. And Smith insisted that to work outward from the texts was problematic because the sources are not only incomplete, but downright misleading. And if your questions come only from them, then however learned you are, your history is going to be a disaster. I'll give you a very simple example, which is something known to people in this room, I have a feeling, or to some people in this room anyway. For example, all surviving rabbinic literature assumed its permanent form. I won't say that it was written. After, probably, the Roman Emperor Caracalla in the year 212, issued a decree granting Roman citizenship to all free Roman subjects. In other words, the last generation of the rabbis responsible for the Mishnah and all Palestinian rabbis subsequently until the arrival of Islam were all Roman citizens. Now, Chaim has actually written a book on this subject. More or less, what does it mean for the rabbis to have been Roman? Rabbinic texts never mention this at all. They never acknowledge it. They never refer to rabbis in any way which suggests that they were Roman citizens. Though this is clearly an extremely important fact about the rabbis, the Palestinian rabbis. If you're constructing your history of the rabbis from rabbinic texts alone, then the issue will not arise. You won't be aware of it. Indeed, until relatively recently, it was not unusual for people to write rabbinic history as if Rome was barely a factor, mistaking the distinctive positionality and poetics of the rabbinic texts for the reality in which real-life rabbis lived. Now, people in this room, Chaim, me, a few others, people elsewhere, have been engaged in the project of trying to, go outside the text and try to resituate Palestinian rabbinic literature in the Roman Empire. It's a very difficult project, but it's doable. It's doable in part, and it can't be done if you're starting from the inside. There's also, if you look at the thing here, one of the things that Keith faults Fergus Miller for, and this is an excerpt from a very famous book review that Keith wrote of Fergus Miller's Emperor in the Roman World, which was a famously harsh book review, and I'm only quoting a single paragraph of it. But basically, the problem with Miller was that he proceeded internalistically. He asked questions that were asked by the sources. He never asked a question that wasn't asked by the sources. And the result for Keith was that the book was deeply flawed. But he also felt that Fergus Miller failed to think systematically about what imperial power meant and how it worked on its subjects. And in order to do this, you need to know something about how societies operated. And in order to do that, you need to actually know something about social theory and other related types of things, and actually think in a systematic and serious way about it. And that's the distinction from Peter Brown, who used it much more eclectically, who used it to, hear this bit of Evans, Pritchard, or Pritchard can illuminate this text. And that for Keith, it wasn't a matter of doing that, although he did that sometimes. It was a matter of, thinking about what it means to be living in a certain type of socioeconomic regime, which is different from ours, and how that affects the way you understand the sources that you have. I think these sorts of considerations actually had a tremendous impact on me, and I think really produced for better or for worse, the mature version of me. And I think I'll just leave it here. I maybe 2 seconds for a brief plug of a book which I am waiting for it to appear on the Jews of Hellenistic and Roman Asia Minor, which is really trying to do for the history of the Jews in the Roman diaspora what Imperialism and Jewish Society did for the history of the Jews in Palestine. In other words, just indicate just how bad it was, how. Because there's a tendency in some of the scholarship to kind of think that the Jews were living it up in the Roman diaspora, that they achieved a level of integration which was quite successful, and they developed institutions which worked, and so on and so forth. And I'm not completely denying that, but I am suggesting that there's more to the story. That's not the interesting part of the story. And with that, I'll just suggest that anyone, Chaim can sort of call on people if anyone has anything to say.
I'm happy to call on people if people prefer to post questions or comments in the chat. I can make sure that those are seen as well.
Looks like Marcia.
So Marcia, please.
Hi, Hi, everybody. I really enjoyed your talk, Seth. I enjoyed it because of what it says about you as a scholar and your development, and I enjoyed it because of what you had to say about people I knew secondhand. They weren't my teachers because I'm a modern Jewish historian, but I certainly knew Morton Smith at Columbia. And I'm about 10 years ahead of you, I think. I
Right.
started graduate school in 72 and got
Yeah.
my PhD in 80. But Morton Smith was a real presence at Columbia in those days. And we women in the department were not fond of him for reasons that I'm sure
Yes.
you're
Well,
aware.
yes.
And I'm not going to say in public because it's not nice. But and I also knew Peter Brown because my husband was a historian of late
Right. Of
antiquity and
course.
admired Peter Brown enormously. So I I guess I don't know the third person you mentioned, Keith
Hopkins. Yeah.
Hopkins. But in any case, I really enjoyed your talk, though, not because I happen to know two of the three people you were talking about, but because what you were doing was probably exactly what Max wanted us to do when she asked us to talk. That is to talk about the scholars who were our intellectual, who had influenced us enormously, even as we didn't do what they did or, followed our own paths. So I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to say that before anybody else asked you a question, that it was really wonderful to
Okay.
see the
Well,
impact of
thank you.
these people on you.
Thank you. For the record, it's not 10 years. I started in 79 and finished in 86.
Oh, so
So
we were even
we overlapped
overlapping.
by 1 year, although
Well, hardly because
I was doing ancient history, not Jewish history. So, I mean, there was an issue with ancient history with continuity because well, we won't get into it, but wasn't there?
I do want
Do
to
you know what I
say,
mean?
though, I just realized that I had thought of something while you were talking, and that is that one of my teachers in Jewish history was Tzvi Khoury, who broke
Okay.
with the Jerusalem school
Yeah.
and who taught us in the 70s to hate the Jerusalem school, not just in ancient history, but also in modern history, because they didn't do what his teacher, Salo Baron, had taught him
Right.
to do, which was to look at the context.
Right. So the Baronian school was total a counter tradition
Was it counted right?
to the Jerusalem tradition. But I wasn't. For those of us who were doing our eccentric thing in ancient Jewish history, I wasn't part. I didn't know anything. I saw Baron every day in the library, but I didn't really know anything about him until much later when I actually began reading Jewish history. Um, but at the time, I didn't know. It's just doing something different.
I see Susan Marks raising her hand.
I want to thank you also. That was just a lot of fun to hear um, your version of how you got here. And so thank you. Um, I do have a question, I think, piggybacking on Marcia's allusion to gender in scholarship. Gender wasn't part of your talk. Maybe it was 4 and 5 that you didn't get to. But I just would sort of challenge you to, did it have any impact in terms of how you looked at institutions? Because for some of us, it was a huge leavening of the
Hmm.
sources and what's not said.
Yes, I mean, I have to confess that in my student days, it was really not something that came up in my environment. I mean, it was beginning to come up in other, at a certain point when I was working on my dissertation, I began to go back and forth between Butler Library and the JTS Library, and the JTS at the time was in the throes of all um, the. It seems strange in retrospect, but the tremendous controversy about ordaining women or admitting women to rabbinical school, and there was something else going on there in the graduate lounge on the fourth floor of Butler in the Burgess Carpenter Lounge. It was, I mean, there wasn't in 1980. I guess it was there, but it was not something that I was hearing that much about. And part of it is just classics in ancient history lagged a lot with things like that. there was just a lag, and it took me quite. I mean, it was only later, not really so much long after that, that I began to think about gender. I have to say that it hasn't been at the center of my work at any point, but it's with each progressive project, it's starting in the mid 1990s, it's certainly informed it a lot more. So yes, I mean it did eventually come to exert an impact on me, and to be another way in which the standard institutional histories obviously fell amazingly short. But it as part of my education, it was amazingly peripheral. And I don't know if that was the case if you were in other subfields of history. Probably not. There, by 1980 or so, that it was definitely getting in there a little bit more. But in ancient history, it wasn't there. And this also may have had something to do with the personalities of the two leading professors of the field. One of whom was Morton Smith, who I mean, he didn't chase after women because that wasn't his orientation. But he clearly didn't think very highly of women. And the other one was sort of chasing after women. And so I won't say no more about that. But, so there was no one to talk about it, although it a little bit on reading lists, on orals lists, reading lists. Not much more than that.
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative or the ventriloquist for the chair's prerogative to ask a question. And this may be a little bit unfair, but when you ended with talking about your current work, and we've exchanged some emails. I'm still looking forward to reading it, but the sort of consciously a pessimistic view of what Judaism diaspora looked like. I wonder if you could put that into the periodization of your own development, right? The Tom Krabel, Hellenism is wonderful. Everybody is, everybody's well integrated and just like the Jews of New York City, right? to, to the recent return to, for instance, Ross Kramer's book, What Christianity Costs the Jews, and the marginalization of Jews and the sort of rejection of lachrymosity of Baron. I wonder if that's an unfair question, or if you can place that in your Bildungsroman.
No, it's not an unfair question at all. I think that in that sense, the current book, which it's finished, it's just being produced for a very long time, and it was also held up by COVID, in a bad way. But I think it's part and parcel of the whole thing. I think, like its predecessor, it's also about, constraints on the Jew's agency. I think that Ross Kramer actually goes too far with a lot of things. She takes lachrymosity a little bit too far. And one of the things that I realized as I was working on this current book was that, so Alf Thomas Krabel wrote a very influential, though never published, dissertation in 1968 called "The Jews of Western Asia Minor" on Roman Imperialism, or something like that, in which basically he argued a lot of things which were actually good practice, like you have to pay attention to local circumstances, but most of his picture really came from his experience as an excavator at the massive synagogue of Sardis. In Lydia, in western Anatolia, because there, it's not in the heart of the city. It's actually at the edge of the city, but there's this massive building complex, a chunk of which, at some point, the Jews of Sardis acquired or bought or were given, and built there an absolutely vast synagogue with a lot of inscriptions in it and everything like that. And at the time of the excavation, the standard view was that this was a structure. The structure was the structure of the second century, and the synagogue was part of the second century structure as a synagogue. So it pointed towards the Jews in the High Roman Empire being clearly prosperous and everything else. But then the tide turned, and within a few years, the synagogue was redated, and it was understood as a secondary or tertiary development of the building. Basically, there was this big Beth gymnasium complex, which, as the city changed its character in the course, basically the later Roman Empire, lost a lot of its original function, so bits and pieces of it were taken over by other groups. And one of these was the Jews, and the standard view now is that the synagogue only became a synagogue in the middle of the 4th century, or a little bit later. Some people will put it back to a century before that, but it doesn't matter all that much. And the archaeology of the synagogue that we have now is an archaeology whose dates are 380 to about 570, something like that, to the end of the 6th century. Once you take Sardis out of the picture, then the evidence of the Jews' integration in the cities of the Greek diaspora, as exemplified by Asia Minor, and it may be the only example actually, but it is exemplified by Asia Minor, collapses because there's nothing left to prove it. The epigraphy, which seems to prove it doesn't, it actually begins to move in the direction of Jews' integration into local societies only in the later 3rd century. And the conclusion that I came to was that if there was any period in which the sort of golden age view of life in the Jewish diaspora was correct, it was actually the 1st century of Christianity. That's when you have evidence, first of all, of Jews taking pride in their Roman identity, and Jews taking pride in their local identity, of Jews serving in official capacities in cities, in government bureaus, on city councils, and things like that. And here Peter Brown was, pretty much on the money. In 410, more or less everything changes. Something happens at the beginning of the 5th century which brings that era to a close. Get into it here. But and that's when the hard late antiquity sets in, and hard late antiquity is characterized by standardization and diffusion of a specific set of Jewish institutions, but also by growing signs of the Jews' sort of withdrawal from their environment. But for the 2nd and early 3rd century and the 1st century, the Jews were not present in the political fabric of the cities and in the higher levels of the social fabric of the cities. The Jews seem to be pretty marginalized and even in some cases abjected. So there, it's clearly there's a family resemblance to the argument that I made in 2001, but with some changes. And I actually see that probably I need to just do the Roman Empire as a whole, the Jews in the Roman Empire, and try to come up with some kind of synthetic picture. But that's it in brief. You're muted.
Yes. I'm going to try very hard to speak and not cough. Thank you, Seth. This was wonderful. And it's not actually exactly what I expected, but it's better because my own sense of the points that have struck me have been more in isolation. And yet the way you spoke was about a community, an intellectual community, a kind of community of thought. And the challenges that you described are collective as well as individual. So I think that's much richer than the kind of more atomized way I'd thought of it. So I loved this. Now I have a number of students here today, and we're going to be talking about postmodern contributions to the study of ancient Judaism in class. And I know that that's a word that might make your skin crawl a little bit, but one of the arguments I sort of made was that the line between a kind of minimalist historiography that's extremely cautious and a kind of postmodern sensibility that's kind of constantly in motion might be less of a real line than we want it to be. And I wondered whether you could speak to either, as you put it, the experience of being surrounded by people who are, postmodern in their outlook, or from a more pragmatic frame of thinking about evidence and framing of it. How do you see the tensions between or the relationships of approaches that might be deemed minimalist or postmodern or whatever it is you want to call what you do? And I did it
Well,
without coughing.
yeah, I think that it's all pretty fuzzy, and there's you could argue that a kind of radical suspicion about the historicity of things is something which resonates well with with some of the components of postmodernism. It should be said that there are people who are closely identified with postmodernism who actually, when they, Foucault was insanely positivist about a lot of things. There you look for the epistemological caution or the epistemological skepticism, and you don't always find it. On the contrary, and so they're also. I mean, did Foucault think of himself as postmodern? I don't know. I'm not an authority, but I don't know if Foucault thought of it. I mean, when we talk about postmodern, there are also new historicists who are, who are not necessarily. They're suspicious. New historicists are suspicious of grand narratives, but they can be very unsuspicious of little chunks of information. And so they want to desystematize history, which is actually a really interesting thing to try to do. And I think and personally, I do think that that structural functionalism of the Anglo-Saxon post-war variety, as embodied in the Past and Present School and the Marxisant, and Keith was one of them also. And I've certainly embraced it to some extent, that it can actually lead to a sort of rigidified account, and it makes you sort of not notice lots of things which actually, where if you were Peter Brown, you'd go crazy over them. You could say, well, superstructure, who cares? It's not important. And and there sometimes that's correct. And that's a criticism that I have, by the way, of Keith Hopkins created a monster, whose name is Walter Scheidel, or Walter Scheidel previously, and so Scheidel just boiled the whole thing down to analysis of systems and the creation of models. They've lost their anchorage in the world of the evidence, and they just exist as objects of beauty on their own, and there's no room for culture in the world of Walter Scheidel. And new historicism, sometimes it's all culture, but culture is really not systematizable. Unless you're a really orthodox Marxist, it's not systematizable, or an orthodox structuralist like Mary Douglas, or something. It's just stuff, which has no easily predictable relationship to socioeconomic structures. If you think about it for a minute. I don't know what postmodernism is anymore.
It's gone. We're in its wake.
Well, we're in its wake. We're in the postmodern period. So I know that I've been appropriated by various Judaic studies postmodernists for various purposes in ways which I find a little bit irritating, but but when postmodernists approach history, some weird things happen. Like when they're dealing with text, okay, it's fine. They're often doing extremely clever things with text, but when they're dealing with history, then I often don't know what I'm looking at. I don't quite get what I'm looking at and where exactly the novelty lies. And to me, when someone of postmodern sensibility does history, it just looks like history. I don't know. So,
No, I think that's wonderful. That's a nice point. I would circle back to Susan Marks's point about the way that if we shift from a strictly materialist perspective to something that's more about embodied and enculturated experience, you do bang into issues of specificity around body, gender, sexuality, ethnicity in ways that I think previous generations very clearly did not negotiate and would have had no
yeah,
time for and no patience with. But they are sort of part of the big picture as well.
yes, absolutely. Right.
Are sorry, Chaim, I am taking back my status as puppet master. Are there any? Would anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment to our wonderful speaker? I think then I might personally take the moment to thank you so much, Seth, for both your thoughtful engagement and also the wonderful riches of work that you've brought our way through all these years. It's a real pleasure to hear your version of you. And we thank you so much for your
Take it
insights.
with a grain of salt.
And I look forward to the day that we bring somebody who will talk about how their work with Seth Schwartz has shaped their own outlook.
Okay, well, don't hold
Thank
your
you all
breath.
so very much for attending. This is the last Jewish Studies event. I believe there's one more Israel Studies event coming up. We thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you at the end of this semester and beginning again next semester. Take care.
Okay, thank you. Thank everyone.